Together with multi-awarded multimedia guru Mr. Noelle Ferrer, let's all level up every Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. here on radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?
If it's entertainment you crave, catch us on New Wave. Surfing through the latest on our shores.
New Wave.
Every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m.
New Wave.
See you there.
Rejoice, refresh, renew, and reflect. Join us for an hour of music that uplifts the soul. Listen to your favorite Jesuit music ministry artists. This is JMM Radio. Get your day's dose of inspirational music. Tune in to JMM Radio. Every Wednesday, only here on radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM. Join Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle as he delivers to us the preachings of the Sunday's Gospel that's awe-inspiring, yet easy to understand and appreciate. Let us all listen to the Word of God here on The Word Exposed on Air, only on radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM.
And there was another drive-by shooting. The fire we reported at the fire hall is still burning out.
Do you sometimes feel confused or lost in the complications and complexities of life? Do you feel drained, listless, or exhausted from the daily burdens and responsibilities? Why not seek our campus ministers on air every Tuesday from 2 to 3 in the afternoon? Listen to our counselors from the Loyola School's Campus Ministry Office as they ground our lives in our faith, in our school's spiritual tradition. Campus Ministers on Air. Be guided, be inspired, be blessed. Listen to our Campus Ministers on Air. Palalimin ang kamalayan sa mga isyong napapanahon. Makisangkot at makiisa kasama ang simbahang lingkod ng bayan. Ang Socio-Political Apostolate ng Kapisanan ni Jesus. Ito ang Kwentuhang Bayan mula alas 11 ng umaga tuwing Biyernes dito lang sa radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM. Dahil naniniwala kami na posible ang isang mas mabuting lipunan at maaari itong simulan sa isang kwentuhan.
Susunod na ang Baka naman Pwede sa radyo-katipunan 87.9 FM.
Radyo-katipunan.
Katipunan. Radyo-katipunan. 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 Voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay at tenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng kwela. Radyo-katipunan. 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 Kawal ni Ignacio, Katipunero sugod, todo sa kayod, tulong at tulong. Lipat na Blue Eagle, galing giting na tigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo-katipunan. Radyo-katipunan. Radyo-katipunan.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede?
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede!
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
Tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo-Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Magandang hapon sa lahat. Nakikinig kayo ngayon sa Baka Naman Pwede, isang programa ng Institute of Philippine Culture at ng Radyo Katipunan na naglalayong pagnilayan ang mga napapanahong issue gamit ang lente ng agham panlipunan o social sciences. Nais din natin mapagkwentuhan ang mga bagay na baka naman pwede nating tignan muli, pag-ukulan ng pansin at aksyonan. Ako si Trixie Beato ng Department of Political Science at Institute of Philippine Culture at ako ang inyong magiging host sa hapong ito. Noong nakaraang episode, nakasama natin sina Jonathan Balsamo, Emmy Ruth Gianan at Lorraine Charmaine Manansala ng PUP para mapag-usapan ang kahalagahan ng kasarinlan sa panahon ng fake news at disinformation. Sir John, hamon sa kasalukuyan ang napahalagahan ang kalayaang tinatamasa natin ngayon sapagkat matagal nang lumipas ang colonial reference ng colonial reference ng Independence Day celebration. Gayunpaman, nanatiling buhay ang collective aspiration ng nakakarami na magkaroon ng kaginhawaan bilang bunga ng kasarinlan. Mula rito, iniuugnay ni Ma'am Emmy ang kalayaan sa estado ng demokrasya at sa tinatawag na capability approach. Aniya, sa isang demokrasya, hindi lang sapat na nakakapili tayo ng leader. Kailangan din nating ng estado, ng kalayaan, sa pamamahayag, pag-oorganisa, paggamit ng hustisya at estado ng mga nasa laylayan, sapagkat lahat ng ito ay nakatali sa pagkakaroon ng panlipunang kaginhawaan. Dagdag naman ni Ma'am Lorraine ang mga social conditions gaya ng class, education at opportunities ay nakakaapekto sa kung paano tatamasin ng bawat individual ang kalayaan at kung paano niya makakamit ang self-actualization. Sa usapin naman ng disinformasyon, tinalakay ni Ma'am Lorraine ang kakulangan ng digital literacy at kung paano ito nakakaapekto sa decision-making at attitude ng mga tao. Ayon naman kay Ma'am Emmy, ang problema sa misinformation at disinformation ay maihahalin tulad sa kondisyon ng asymmetric information. Aniya, malaki ang social cost ng pagkalat ng maling impormasyon sa lipunan gaya ng vaccine hesitancy, HIV stigma, pagsasayang ng pondo ng gobyerno at pagkawala ng tiwala ng tao sa kapwa at mga institusyong panlipunan. Mas naging concern naman ni Sir Jonathan ang paraan ng pagko-communicate ng mga research findings at fact-checking initiatives ng mga akademiko at ng mga organisasyon. Aniya, kailangan nating i-revisit ang ating approach at tignan ang mga pamamaraang mas constructive at inklusibo sa pagbibigay kaalaman at pagtatama ng maling impormasyon sa lipunan. Sa mga gustong balikan ang mga nakaraang episodes ng Baka Naman Pwede, mangyari lamang na bisitahin ang Facebook page ng Institute of Philippine Culture at ng Radyo Katipunan. Ngayong hapon, pumunta naman tayo sa larangan ng sining. Makakasama natin si Noelle Sepina, PhD candidate in Ethnic Studies mula sa University of California, San Diego para pag-usapan ang idea ng cultural collaborations sa filmmaking. Sa mga manonood natin sa Facebook, pwede kayong sumali sa aming kwentuhan. Mangyari lamang na i-type ang inyong mga komento at katanungan sa comment section at babasahin namin ang mga ito sa ating Q&A portion mamaya. Bilang panimula, hayaan niyo munang ipakilala ko sa inyo ang ating bisita. Noelle Sepina is a PhD candidate in Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. Her dissertation, Made in the Philippines, Blaxploitation and Transnational Collaborations in the Marcos Era, is the first study to examine both blaxploitation films within Philippine cinema and the Philippine perspective of transnational filmmaking in the context of Black cinema. Her work combines oral narratives, film analysis, historical documents, and critical theory as to shed light on Filipino and Black resistance movements, as well as the lasting impacts of U.S. imperialism on the Philippines. Noelle is also a filmmaker and community programmer. Her first short documentary, This is Historic Filipino Town, tells the stories of Filipino American experiences of immigration, migration, and gentrification in downtown Los Angeles through the lens of two Filipino business owners from two different generations. She also organizes and hosts local community film screenings and conversations to discuss issues of representation and resistance. She is currently working with the Filipino Migrant Center and the San Diego Malaya Movement's People's History Project to facilitate a summer program that teaches Filipino American youth how to produce short documentaries on about the experiences of the San Diego Filipino community. So sa ating mga tagapakinig at manonood, bigyan natin masigabong virtual na palakpakan si Miss Noelle Sepina. So welcome to Baka Naman Pwede, Noelle. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So maybe just to start off, well, first, thank you very much, Noelle, for accepting our invitation this afternoon. I know it's the time difference was a bit of something we had to navigate, but maybe to kick off our episode, baka naman pwede, since you understand a bit of Filipino, baka naman pwede mo kaming kwentuhan kung, ano yung mga pinagkakaabalahan mo this past couple of days? What keeps you busy? How have you been?
I've been very busy with a lot of really great opportunities. The sun finally came out today in San Diego. It's been very cloudy for the past few weeks. So I've been doing a lot of things, writing, grading papers, and also fun stuff like the youth program with the high school students, teaching them about documentary filmmaking. I also do crochet. So as a hobby, I also crochet. So I spend a lot of time doing that, watching movies, just resting as much as I can since it's summer now.
All right. Well, that's good to hear. I'm with you on that same boat of checking papers. It's that time of I think it's a perennial problem or perennial state for teachers. And I'm also with you on crocheting. So I also like crocheting.
Oh,
So
cool.
So actually, I realized that a part of your dessert is since you're very focused on the San Diego Filipino community. It made me realize that I think there is a sizable Filipino community there. One of my closest friends actually migrated to San Diego. So that's
Oh.
maybe a small world, or maybe not so small since there is quite a sizable Filipino diaspora there.
Mm-hmm.
On to the more exciting part. So, well, as mentioned in the introduction to this episode and a little bit about you, in your dissertation and your research, you talk about transnational or cultural collaborations, which is I think the center point of our discussion today. So maybe you could start by telling us what do these mean? What do you mean by transnational and cultural collaborations? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what also got you interested in studying these two?
Okay, well, so the concept of transnational collaboration, how I define it, is the mutually beneficial yet unequal political and cultural arrangements between the US and the Philippines, which are rooted in the legacies of colonialism. So I think there's a lot of research, and it's pretty well known now that there was political collaborations between the U.S. government and the Marcos regime during the 1970s, right? but less people, like it's not as well known that they were also cultural collaborations between the US and the Philippine film industries that occurred at the same time. So my focus is on the collaborations between the film industries during the Marcos era, because those collaborations in the political realm kind of created possibilities for these cultural collaborations.
All right. So actually, well, yeah, that's a. I think I think at least on a personal note, I knew that the Marcos legacy also involved also a sort of cultural. There was also cultural capital also, since there was the Manila Film Center, Imelda Marcos's preference for art, but I didn't realize that there was also the U.S. also played a role. So maybe you could talk about what got you interested in studying these cultural collaborations, or at least specifically between the US and the Philippines.
Yes. Should I tell you the long story version or the short story?
We're all about long stories, so maybe you could share.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, because when I was there last summer in Manila doing research, and almost everybody that I talked to about my topic asked me that question, like, how did you get to this topic, So it took a lot of rabbit holes and detours. But really, this project started for me when I was an undergrad back in 2011. So I started my research in African American studies, and I did research on the Philippine Revolution. And I learned that some African American soldiers that were part of the US military switched sides during the war to fight with the Filipino soldiers. So that for me really planted a seed of interest in thinking about Filipino resistance, and also histories of collaboration and solidarity between Filipino and Black communities. So that was like part one. And then when I went to do my master's degree, I started studying the Black Power movement a little bit more. And I wrote my master's thesis on the People Power Revolution and how the United States media portrayed that through photography. So I was looking at film and photography and how these movements were documented by the US media, essentially. And then I came to my PhD and kind of took a detour. I started to become more interested in the idea of memory, dreams, and imagination. And I came across Kidlat the Himik's Perfume Nightmare. So have you seen that movie, or are you familiar with Kidlat the Himik's?
I haven't, unfortunately. Maybe you might have to tell me a little bit about it.
Okay, so that film is one of my all-time favorite films, and it's nothing. My dissertation ended up being nothing about that. But it's still an inspiration, because part of what I was interested in that film is how the story of the Philippine Revolution is reimagined, and how the characters fascinated with the US space program and like the radio. It's called Voice of America. So like the American radio being played in the Philippines during that time. So it came out in 1977. So this was also during the period of martial law. And so I started thinking, how can I make a dissertation about this movie? And I was wanting to think about how Filipino filmmakers negotiate the memories of US imperialism in the post-colonial period. And from there, I developed the concept of transnational collaboration to understand how the US and the Philippines, how their relationship played out through cinema. So originally, I was looking at film as like an alternative source of history. And I was going to look at 3 different genres of Philippine cinema. And then I realized that one genre is enough. So I had to, shift a little bit and focus. And that's where exploitation came in. So I was looking on Amazon Prime for films by Eddie Romero and Jerry De Leon that they did for the US market, which I had read about in an article, and it was in the horror genre. So I was looking for them, but they weren't available for viewing. But I found films that they made with Pam Grier, who is the blaxploitation icon. And since I had already been doing research in Black cinema and on the Black Power movement, it made sense for me to focus on blaxploitation that was made in the Philippines.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Wow, okay. I love listening to that story because I think it well on for the students perhaps who may be listening, I think it showcases really how research kind of transforms and how research is also maybe taking your different interests, seeing their intersection. So at least on a personal note, that was amazing for me to hear. But I think what I at least it's very interesting to me how you highlighted how yeah, maybe how in the context of US imperialism how there are sort of um intersections between the experiences perhaps of the Black Power movement, or at least Black people, as well as Filipinos, especially in the context of the Marcos regime perhaps, and maybe how that has and how there are a lot of intersections in terms of their movements related to anti-imperialism and maybe to a certain extent decolonization as well. But maybe I think more on your research topic. So you talked a lot about how you settled on the inters on black exploitation, and how that you kind of became one of also the anchors or conceptual anchors to your research. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what is black exploitation. What are examples that of black exploitation in TV that we can see, or in film. Maybe we can start.
Yes, definitely. So I think I need to define blaxploitation and B movies, right? So blaxploitation is the film genre that really developed in the early 1970s in the United States. And it was originally made by Black filmmakers for Black audiences that were starring Black actors, right? Because prior to that, you know, Black people in films, they were only portrayed as like side characters or servants, maids, or just in very, you know, what's the word? Submissive positions. Like they weren't ever in a positions of power or agency in Hollywood films. So it started out as like a independent film movement. And so the first one of the films that's credited with starting it is called Sweet Sweetback, Sweet Sweetback and Shaft. So those both came out in 1971. And then basically after the success of Sweet Sweetback, Hollywood producers saw that, oh, this is making a lot of money. Let's go and exploit the audience and exploit these themes. So that's where the blaxploitation, the name blaxploitation comes from, because it's a combination of the word black and exploitation. So they're exploiting Black audiences' desires to see Black characters on screen. And it was also part of the Black Power movement's like cultural production, because during that time, right, in the Black Power movement, it was all about empowerment of Black communities. And so that was done through representation and culture, and the idea that Black is beautiful and it's just celebrating Blackness. So yeah, these films kind of were a part of that movement, although it wasn't always a accurate reflection of the movement, if that makes sense. So, it wasn't accepted by all the people that were part of the movement, because they were criticizing it for being, glamorizing violence and sex. And so there were problems with the genre. And I think that's a big part of why it was so short-lived. So it only lasted for about 5 or 6 years officially in the 70s. Yeah. But we do see the influence of the genre still throughout cinema. And so I think Quentin Tarantino is probably the most famous filmmaker who's a reference for how blaxploitation has influenced cinema beyond just that period in the 70s. So, do you know Quentin Tarantino?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so Kill Bill, right? Kill Bill, Pulp Fiction, he did those films, but so the most, I guess, popular modern version of blaxploitation would be the film called Jackie Brown, which is starring Pam Grier. And Foxy Brown is another famous one from the 70s. What else? Coffee, Cleopatra Jones.
Oh, okay. So, well, maybe you can help me, at least maybe. So this is one of my first, at least I think I'm a little more, I'm a little more, at least coming from the talking points from today. I was more familiar with, let's say, well, at least, let's say, blackface, or at least those, that phenomena. But I think at least what I'm getting from our discussion so far is that, blaxploitation also emerged as a kind of movement that was, blaxploitation was a movement in film that was a little maybe hotly contested because of, again, maybe the how it portrayed black people, and how that, maybe, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, ran counter to the Black Power movement and what it was all about, because of, how it did portray black actors, even though it was coming from black filmmakers. Did I get that correctly?
I'm sorry if I confused you. To clarify, what I was saying is that it, how can I explain? So I am looking at it in this way, and more recent scholars are also looking at it in this way, where we're saying that these films were part of the Black Power movement, and that they were resisting the dominant portrayal of Black people in cinema during. That's one view of it, and then another view of it, which was the more critical version, that was contemporary to when the films were coming out. So in the 70s and in the 90s, there was a more critical view of these films as, perpetuating stereotypes of violence and sex and drug use. And more recent scholarship is revisiting this idea that is very, revolutionary to have these films made in the way that they were. And it did start out as like independent films that were made by Black filmmakers, but then once Hollywood started making a lot of money from that, and Hollywood and the white directors and the studios came in and started making their own films. And so that's how the Philippines came into the picture.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. All right. So for patiently clarifying that. So maybe that's what we can. So that's actually, so you provided a good segue into my next question. Is, yeah, how do also, thanks for setting the terms. So how do Filipino filmmakers come into that? Like, how did they into that picture of the blaxploitation, and maybe you can extend that to how did that also go into the context of the time, which was the Marcos regime, or at least the context of your, how did Filipino films come into that?
So there's a history of the U.S. film industry making film in the Philippines with Filipino crew. So according to Teddy Ko, who is a film archivist there in the Philippines, he told me that it started at least in the 1950s, when there was the American Propaganda Office that was in propaganda films in the Philippines by Filipino crew during the Cold War period. So from there, that kind of established the institution of this collaboration, right, in cinema. And we get to the late 60s, Eddie Romero and Jerry De Leon, they start working with American producers, and they were mostly making B movies, and B movies right now. The station and B movie kind of similar, and B's has you know, there's different definitions of that term as well, but for me, how I'm using it is the low budget production. It's a low budget production, usually with an inferior quality. So it's not seen as something to be taken seriously, right? So it doesn't fall into the category of the, art house independent films that are also low budget, or obviously doesn't follow the standard of a major studio production, right? So the main reason why the US went to go make these films in the Philippines was because it was cheaper, right? So they could exploit the labor of Filipino filmmakers. And because they had that relationship through US imperialism, they already had this special friendship, right, with the Philippines that allowed them to make these films. So just for an example, like a concrete example of how that all comes together, one of the filmmakers who partnered with Eddie Romero was in the military, US military. And I think he fought in World War II, and he decided to stay in the Philippines afterwards. And that's when he somehow met Eddie Romero, and then they started working together on these films for the US market. Is that clear? I'm sorry if I'm all over the place.
No, it makes sense. I think
Yeah.
it's good that we establish a sort of historical context also. So maybe the next question would be, so coming from that idea, at least coming from this context of collaboration, that historical context, maybe we could talk about how might Filipino filmmakers coming from then, at least coming from the idea, be, I guess, complicit or at least be part of the phenomena of black exploitation.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes. So adding on to my last point first, how Filipino filmmakers got to the blaxploitation is because, so like I said, they were already working with American filmmakers, right? They were doing horror films, they were doing war films, and so by the late and then they were doing the prison films, which kind of then led to the blaxploitation films. So it was started in the late 60s, and forgive me if this is not completely 100% accurate information because I can't remember all the details right now. But basically, by the 1970s, right, in the US, blaxploitation was becoming more popular. And because the whole premise of exploitation filmmaking is to make money, right, the American producers saw the opportunity to also make these types of films in the Philippines. So it's kind of like a double whammy, right? Like they could exploit the cheap labor in the Philippines, and then they could also exploit this audience in the US. And so it started out with the prison films, and I'm looking at those prison films as incorporating the kind of themes and elements of blaxploitation. And so it was like a mixture of genres coming together. And it was those films that were starring Pam Grier that then led to her becoming the blaxploitation icon that she became, right? So the first blaxploitation film starring a Black woman was with Pam Grier, called Coffee. And that came out in 1973 after she did the film Black Mama, White Mama, which was directed by Eddie Romero.
I see.
Yes.
Sorry about
So how Filipinos can be complicit in anti-Blackness, for example, in one of the interviews that Pam Grier talks about her experience working in the Philippines, she was saying that she loved making movies there and she learned a lot, but when it came to having a stunt double, she said that they didn't have a stunt double for her as a Black woman, so they had essentially a Filipino person in blackface to be her stunt double. So I'm not sure exactly for which film that happened for. I think maybe one of the earlier ones from like 1971. And it's hard to know exactly like what happened because the information is not as available. So I'm still trying to figure out what happened, like how that worked. But eventually, I think they did get stunt doubles, or I'm not sure. But Eddie Romero says that Pam Grier did a lot of her own stunts. And so the question that I was wondering is like, is this because there was no stunt double, or because she just really wanted to do her own stunts? So.
I see. Okay. Yeah, it's okay. So I think that highlights at least you thank you for sharing that, because I think that history highlights you kind of like coming from at least the term that you talked about, that sort of double whammy that the United States was, you know, capitalizing on the cheap labor in the Philippines, and also capitalizing on these narratives that were essentially not theirs, right, or not their kind of stories to tell. And I think what made me think of is just kind of why it's important to take a sort of intersectional look into film. At least this is what, at least the sense of what I'm getting. So maybe at least transitioning into what you found so far, because you kind of talked about how it's a little difficult, of course, to maybe get those narratives, because maybe you can talk a little bit about, so maybe so far in your research, so far in your findings, how does maybe what has this told you perhaps about that sort of negotiation that you were talking about, how what has your research shown in terms of how Filipino filmmakers perhaps negotiate that memory or that sort of experience of US imperialism? Maybe at least because I found that such an interesting sharing earlier. Maybe what can you share what you found so far?
So when I was there in Manila, I did do some archival research in the Noelle Film Institute. So I found newspaper articles on about Jerry De Leon, Eddie Romero, and Sergio Santiago's work. So those are the three Filipino filmmakers that I am focusing on. And it was really kind of sad to see what they were writing about, how they had this vision and these goals for Filipino cinema to be seen internationally and to be taken seriously, right? And at the end of it, they kind of just, well, for Eddie Romero, at least, I think at the end of his career, he kind of, not in the end of his career, but sorry, let me back up. But he was saying that he was very hopeful, right, for Philippine cinema to be in the international market, which is why he was making these films with the United States in the first place, right? But because of that imperial relationship and just the way that the West sees the third world in general, they couldn't give them the same respect or like value to the production as if it were like a American or like a white film. So that's why they were stuck in this exploitation market. They had to make these films that, Eddie Romero says like there was no substance and he just tried to develop it as much as he could. But the producers, they just wanted, the violence, they wanted the sex, they just wanted the things that they could make money off of. Whereas the directors that were making these films in the Philippines were actually very serious artistic filmmakers, right? Like they were national artists. So I think that's also what makes this so interesting is that they never got to show their Filipino films or like their more serious films internationally. And he after Apocalypse Now, actually, because Eddie Romero was one of the producers on Apocalypse Now, which everyone knows was made in the Philippines, right? He ended up basically not wanting to work with Americans again and just gave up on the idea of Philippine cinema being in the international market. And I think it was also because of the what was happening in Philippine cinema at that time too, right? That he said he wanted to focus more on like local Filipino films, since there was a lot more new energy around Philippine cinema at that time, Lino Broca and the other younger filmmakers, if that makes sense. And same thing kind of with Sirio Santiago. I found this letter that he wrote to I think it was the FDCP or some institution in the film industry, and he was writing about how something like we should get tax breaks or something like that. Like this film should be recognized as a Filipino film because it was made by Filipinos, but we had to use white American actors in order for it to be seen here. So it's kind of this like struggle to be like acknowledged as a Filipino film, but then in the United States it's seen as a Filipino film, so automatically it's not good, right? It's like a B movie, which means it's like less quality, so yeah, there's just that tension that it was like they had to do this to survive and then also to try to gain that international recognition, but then it was only within this like limited opportunity. And then in the Philippines, these films weren't even recognized as part of Philippine cinema,
Yeah. I think that at least that is already like a great, at least what you've shared kind of does shed light on at least the backdrop of our conversation, which is really the lasting legacy of US imperialism and US colonialism, especially among, I think, the marginalized groups, like let's say Filipinos, or in the context of Black people, and the impact also of the on the impact of Black exploitation on the Black Power movement, but at least maybe focusing on the Filipino aspect. I think what you've shared kind of highlights at least maybe that sort of tension or those kinds of concessions perhaps that they had to make. And I think that's what I think those that poses a very interesting question also as to what Filipino, maybe what this says about the future also. But maybe before I get into that question, maybe you could, so you talked about doing archival research here in the Philippines. So unfortunately, I think you were in the Philippines, but maybe I didn't get to see you at IPC. But so for those listening, she was a visiting research associate at IPC. Maybe you can talk also a little bit about what were the challenges, if any, that you encountered during your research so far, particularly when you did archival research in the Philippines?
Yeah, I think what was challenging, besides the weather and the traffic, and getting sick, I realized that because there was censorship, right? So the films that I was looking at are from 1971 to 1976, and martial law started in 1972. So when I went to the Rizal Library at Ateneo, I was looking specifically for newspapers from that period of when the films were released to see how, if they were promoting it or just like any reviews or what was just happening during that time. And the person in the library told me, oh, there's nothing during that time period because of censorship. And there was only one newspaper, I think, being published at that time. So I think that was one of the challenges that I encountered, was being able to find things that were happening during this period of censorship, and also that happened prior to when the archiving started. So like for example, the Molson Film Institute, I think, opened in the late 70s. So their
Mhm.
materials, I think, didn't have the early 70s. Yeah. And also because I think there's a bigger problem in the archiving of Philippine cinema. Like it's hard to find certain films, right? Like I was trying to find the older films of Jerry De Leon and Eddie Romero, and it's really hard to find or not available. So I think with in our field in ethnic studies, they encourage us to also talk about what is not there as much as what is there.
There. Oh, I see. I think I
So,
forgot to mention earlier that. Sorry, go ahead. Did I?
oh, there was another point that I wanted to go back to, but you can say yours first and then I'll come back to it.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
But I forgot, so I have to remember it.
Um, I mean, I think I forgot to say earlier that perhaps, yeah, I think that was one crucial idea that that I realized you maybe form part of that overall context that which you mentioned, yeah, the sense of censorship, and when you talk about at least that sort of the dynamic of imperialism, I also I almost forgot that you're also looking at films made during a time of censorship or the Marcos regime, right? And it's 1971 to 1976. So that
Mhm.
sense of that sense of more than aside from that overall dynamic between a sort of great power and the Filipino people, there's also that added layer of the authoritarianism in the Philippines and kind of limited portrayals of Filipino people, also limited realities. So I guess that also forms maybe part of understanding the context or understanding how at least how the filmmakers then were negotiating also that sort of memory, the roles that they played in terms of those films. At least that's what I'm learning or thinking about coming from our conversation.
Yeah. Yes, I have so much to say about all of that. So I really appreciate you bringing up these things and understanding what I'm saying. So I
Of
just wanted
course.
to respond to that, but also go back to what we were talking about earlier with the collaborations and the how Filipino filmmakers were in this kind of position to um how they were complicit in this exploitation as well. So I'm looking at it in two ways as well. Like on the one hand, they did participate in that exploitation, but on the other hand, they were also um, collaborating on a subversive level. So, they did have to do what they had to do with making films that were um, kind of
Mm.
creating new stereotypes of Blackness in cinema, but they were also giving opportunities to Black actors that might not have had these opportunities in Hollywood, right? So,
Mm.
like the example with Pam Grier, she talks a lot about how for her working in the Philippines, she had the opportunity to learn how to be on be on a crew and be in the cast. So it wasn't like, where she only had to be an actor or she could only be an actor. She was also learning the process of filmmaking behind the scenes, right? And so with her, it opened up more opportunities for other Black actresses after her, right? And it was because of that condition of filming in the Philippines and the like low budgetness of it, where producers maybe it was like lower stakes for them that they could invest in and take the risk, right? Because it's not like $1 million movie, and
Mm.
do you know what I mean?
Mm.
So um I'm really wanting to focus also on how these films, because of the censorship process, since they were
Mm.
going to the United States and they weren't meant to be shown in the Philippines, they didn't go through the censorship process.
Mm.
So that's something that makes them also very interesting, is how Filipino filmmakers could also, you know, include some anti-imperialist or critiques of the dictatorship in the films because they weren't going to be seen in the Philippines.
I see.
Yeah, so that's where the transnational collaboration is
Yeah.
kind of happening, right? Where you see ideas of Black power making its way to the Philippines, right? And then there's these ideas of anti-imperialism going to the US, and it's all happening at the margins of cinema where nobody is like, checking to see what's happening.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, and I think maybe so thank you for adding that also, because I think that adds that whole, that sense of the exchange that did happen. I think, and at least maybe part of that, or at least maybe coming from what you've shared so far, it kind of highlights maybe the kind of push and pull. There are points of complicitness. I mean, if I can be so bold as to say, right, there are points of maybe complicitness, but there's also points of collaboration, or at least there are points of, like you said, there are moments, or at least there are points of solidarity that you see that maybe get amplified, or whether intentionally or unintentionally through film. Um, so maybe coming from what you've shared so far, so at least coming from what you've shared so far, maybe the question that I have next is, so especially since you also work towards teaching Filipino American youth how to produce short documentaries, and you also are active in teaching, like you said, the high school students. What does your, or at least what does your research findings, or where do you, or what comes next, maybe excuse me, sorry, what comes next after finding these negotiations, or understanding these negotiations? What do you think that could say about our film industry? What does that mean perhaps for Filipino or maybe Black filmmakers as well?
Ooh, I love that question. I think for me, in my research, really I am trying to make these connections between the struggles um, in these two communities, right? And in this diaspora. So that's something that I teach my students, and I see film as a place where this is happening. And it's like this happens in very natural kind of ways too, like through culture and creative projects. So it's very beautiful to see. And there's other Black filmmakers that I work with here, and follow their traditions of filmmaking, and they're also working with Filipino stories. So if I can just plug one film, my professor, Zainabu Irene Davis, she is a independent Black filmmaker from. She started in UCLA, so she was part of this group of independent Black filmmakers called the LA Rebellion, and they started in the 1970s as well. So again, there's this overlap of stuff happening at that time. And her latest short film is called Pandemic Bread, and it's about a Filipino interpreter who takes a call during the COVID pandemic and has to translate for the elderly Filipino patient. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I will definitely check that out. And I think yeah, I searched it up just now. It looks, and I think those kinds of intersections, as you said, are so interesting. Like maybe how these things. I think something that you talked about, something that you said earlier, struck me. That sense of how these collaborations, or at least how that kind of dynamic was seen and happening all at the same times, but at the margins, or at least something that is largely unseen by maybe the larger population, and that's why it's important. I think, well, your example, at least Pandemic Bread by Zainabu Davis, I think kind of highlights that, or at least that those sorts of discussions, because I think coming from the perspective of someone who is based in the Philippines, I don't think that these conversations are had enough, that are points of solidarity, or that there are these sort of collaborations with other groups of people, particularly, marginalized groups of people, particularly people who have also experienced particularly people who have also experienced, maybe similar themes, or similar or have sort of shared experiences, parallel experiences to our past. I think that's something, that's one of the my takeaways for today.
Yeah, and I think also, like, even, I didn't even realize it till when I was preparing for this, that I think it's interesting that I was studying the Black Power movement and the People Power Revolution at the same time while I was doing my master's degree. And I don't know if I knew that I was making those connections already at the time. But when I wrote it down, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense, right? And but I did also always wonder about, like, okay, it's called People Power. Like, where did they get that phrase from? Was there any influence from the Black Power movement? And I don't know if anybody there has already been talking about this or has done research on this. But the Black Power movement was very influential to a lot of other movements around the world, right? Like the third world liberation movements in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. So it's not a stretch to think that there was some influence there. And yeah, like these movies, some of these blaxploitation movies did play in the Philippines too, right? Like I know Shaft played there, and the music too that was being um, distributed in the Philippines had these messages in them too, right? So, yeah.
And I think maybe part of the conversation, at least part of the conversation, is maybe also how you're maybe like on so we talked a lot about, of course, the positive, or at least the subversive messages that how were kind of embedded through those films, and like you said, part of your works, part of the scholarly, at least that scholarly, at least the, like you said, one of the sides of the discourse on black exploitation that maybe talks about its contribution to the Black Power movement. But I think maybe part of the conversation is maybe also how kind of the other side of the coin, and how kind of maybe, maybe uh how this dynamic also kind of got internalized, or at least that sort of kind of like how, let's say, in the Philippines, for example, I think about how contemporary examples of black people, for example, in Filipino films, are usually still caricatures. There's not a lot of there's sort of that sort of internalized colorism also within the Philippines. Would you say that that's somehow related, or is it maybe different entirely?
I think it goes back way before that.
Mhm.
I think that is something that we definitely do need to discuss more of. And um, I brought up the example of the blackface in the, for the stunt double, right? But we could see the examples of blackface actually happening on the screen too, right? Like even still today. So I think, as somebody who's not living in the Philippines, it's hard for me to know how people there see it and how or where it's coming from. So I don't want to, impose my outside view, but just how, from my understanding, I do believe that it's comes from the legacies of colonialism even before the United States, right? Like Spain colonized Philippines, and um, I think the way that it's shown up in the Philippine culture, maybe more so from the United States culture, right? Because the blackface is specific to US anti-black
Yeah.
racism, I believe. You could fact check me on that. But the idea of, and the ideologies and beliefs of anti-blackness go way, way farther back.
Mm. I see. All right. Well, And I think also, unfortunately, we are approaching towards the end of our conversation, but maybe before we kind of transition to sort of closing the conversation, yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about, since you're talking about possibilities, negotiating memories, you can maybe talk a little bit more about, yeah, like what you said, the People's History Project and the your work with the Filipino American youth. At least I think it would be good to end on that note, so we don't end on the note of racism, which is of course a very important.
Yeah. So what are we doing? So it's also about teaching the youth about the history of Filipino migration to the United States. So we're teaching them history and then also showing them how to document their family's migration history. So it's yeah, we're right. Earlier you had said that there is a large population of Filipinos in San Diego, and that is primarily because of the US military bases here. And wherever there's a military base in the US, wherever there's a US military base, there is a bunch of Filipinos, right? So it's that because of that imperial history. And so we're teaching them this in this context, and also how we can be in solidarity with other marginalized communities here, given the connections between our histories. So, in San Diego, there's also a large Mexican population and Black population. So we're working to get them to think about these solidarities as well, or like be in solidarity with these groups.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. And I wish you, of course, the best of luck in pursuing that. I think it's an amazing opportunity to have those conversations, talk about that sense of solidarity. Maybe before, well, and so far, overall, really, the conversation was an opportunity for me to learn more, to understand. Um, I thank you for that kind of monumentous task of, I think it's very important work to go through that task of understanding meaning making, understanding that sort of negotiation, memories, and you're really trying to trace those connections. So really, hats off to you, and thank you so much
Thank
for our insightful conversation so
you.
far. Um, Before we end the episode, we'd like to ask you, Noelle, if there's maybe a key takeaway that you hope our audience would remember from your sharing this afternoon our time. But we can maybe start, or if you can start it, your takeaway with the phrase, baka naman pwede. So sort of to, yeah, again, help bridge those wishes with actionable points. Yeah.
Okay. Before I do that, can I just add one more point because I did not make this point, which I need to really emphasize that a big part of my project is the oral narratives of Filipino filmmakers, because what is missing from this topic is the perspective of Filipino people, right? So it's only ever been discussed through the colonial gaze, the colonial lens, or like a US perspective, right? So that's part of what I did when I was in the Philippines, is I met with filmmakers and did interviews with them. So that's a big part of um, my project. And hopefully eventually this becomes a documentary itself.
Oh, okay. Looking forward
Yeah.
to that too. I'll definitely. Yeah.
Yes. So key takeaways. I guess I've already said it, but yeah, baka naman pwede. We can think about how our histories and struggles of resistance are connected and challenge anti-Blackness in the Filipino community and culture in general, because we need to love ourselves more, and from that we can love everyone, and love is everything. So we need love, and we need to love ourselves.
Right. Thank you so much, Noelle. And to our viewers, dito nagtatapos ang Baka Naman Pwede. So again, thank you so much, Noelle, for accepting our invitation and for sharing your research, your project. And we really wish you the best in turning it into a documentary, writing your dissertation. So we look forward to seeing where that leads you. Baka naman pwedeng i-like nyo rin to our audience ang Institute of Philippine Culture sa Facebook para sa iba pa naming announcements at events. So hanggang sa susunod, ako si Trixie Beato mula sa IPC. Patuloy tayong mag-ingat at laging tandaan kung may gustong maunawaan, baka naman pwede nating pag-usapan. So maraming salamat sa lahat.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede.
Baka naman pwede.
Mga isyung napapanahon ating pag-usapan.
Baka naman pwede.
Gamit ang mga pananaw mula sa iba't ibang kalinangan.
Baka naman pwede.
Mula sa Institute of Philippine Culture, kami inyong samahan, tayo'y maghuntahan. Dito lang sa
Baka naman pwede.
tuwing Huwebes, alas 3 ng hapon, dito lang sa Radyo-Katipunan 87.9 FM.
3 o'clock prayer. You died, Jesus, but the source of life flowed out for souls, and the ocean of mercy opened up for the whole world. O fountain of life, immeasurable divine mercy, cover the whole world and empty yourself out upon us. O blood and water, which flowed out from the heart of Jesus as a fountain of mercy for us, I trust in you. Holy God, holy mighty one, holy immortal one, have mercy on us and the whole world. Holy God, holy mighty one, holy immortal one, have mercy on us and the whole world. Holy God, holy mighty one, holy immortal one, have mercy on us and the whole world. Amen. Jesus, King of mercy, we trust in you.
Radyo-Katipunan. News, insights, inspiration. Radyo-Katipunan. Down from the hill and down to the world. Radyo-Katipunan. The voice of the Blue Eagle.